So I started writing this book because a few years ago, the Surgeon General declared that loneliness is an epidemic. And so we all feel a sense of loneliness in some form or another in our lives. So at some level, we all experience what that is. But this book actually takes a deeper dive into what about the ethnic or racial minority? What about the immigrant? What about the refugee? What about my neighbor who's a person of color or the person in my workplace who's from a different ethnic background or cultural background. So I was really wondering about the impacts of loneliness on the ethnic minority and the racial minority. And so that's part of the reason that I was writing this book. But another reason was about less than 10 years ago, the politics that were happening in our country, the 2016 election, the cultural things that were happening in our society, all of that too was happening at once. And the conversation was about immigrants. The conversation was about the foreigner and the person who is different from us. And that also included me because I am also an immigrant. And all of a sudden I felt very in pulled into this conversation at a different level than I had experienced before. So there were definitely impacts being a person of color, growing up in the United States, growing up and living in white majority spaces where I was consistently the minority person. So, but then it was completely different. When I all of a sudden felt I had always, even though I was a US citizen and I felt secure in that, but then all of a sudden I didn't feel secure in that. So all of that just drove this idea of me feeling so isolated and feeling like an outsider in a different way. So not just personally in my environment, but also in a political sense, feeling um, like I was being othered and somebody was telling me that I didn't belong here. So all of those things together had an impact on me personally in my own journey, and that's what led to the writing of this book. Sure. So I think at that time when my parents were seeking a place to live, we were living in South Dakota. So we had been living there for several years, and the snow and the cold weather was a little overwhelming. And so they wanted to move somewhere nicer, a better climate, warmer. So as they were seeking out places, and I don't know how the process was, but one of the places was this small town in Alabama. And so I guess it was probably some sort of employment agency, right, that was involved in this. And so they said, there's this place down south. So we flew down there, and my parents just fell in love with this little town. It had hills around, it was really pretty. The sky was blue, the sun was shining. They went to the schools, they visited the schools, loved the schools. And how they had organized, their elementary school, like every grade had its own little building, and the classrooms were in what they were pods. They called them pods. So we were all in these little circular buildings, and they thought it was fabulous. And they said, okay, the town was basically saying, please come. We need a doctor. We'd love to have you here. So there were people who were very welcoming and kind and wanted us there and just welcomed us. But then there were people who didn't really want us there. And so this was actually not even 10 years past. No, it was a little past. Yes, it was 12 years past the Civil Rights Act that had passed. Okay, so we're still in that era. We're talking about the late 1970s, and there's still racial tensions, and there's things. The KKK is still there. I mean, it's not like things had changed automatically since 1964. Um, so, and actually, I should probably back up a little, and the listeners probably know that 1965 was the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which opened up the doors to more immigrants coming from Asia and Africa. And that is actually the act that opened up the door for my parents to come, because they needed more. They were looking for people with a certain kinds of education, and my dad fit that category, and that's what opened the door for him to come to the United States. Um, so we were one of those earlier waves that came through those immigration channels as part of the National Immigration Act. And that is what has dramatically changed our actual population of the United States. Um, so anyway, growing up though, you asked about growing up. Growing up, I was growing up in a small school, and there was nobody else like me except my sister going to the same school. Nobody else that looked like me. Nobody else that was, I, there were maybe a couple of other Asian people, but not Indian Americans, not South Asians. Um, and so I grew up with not having anyone who could understand what it was like to be in this immigrant family, to be South Asian, to have parents who had a different cultural experience, and we were all kind of navigating this together. I was the oldest child, going to school, learning all these new things, bringing things home, bringing ideas home, talking about different things. So it was a different way of that my parents had grown up. And so navigating all of those cultural dynamics and changes with nobody else really. So all those years I always thought, oh, I wish I had someone who could kind of understand this is what it's like, but I couldn't articulate it at the time. I was just a child. It took years later. This has been a journey of many, many years to be able to name and articulate things that I experienced. I think I experienced was when I was growing up, my parents were very much assimilating. We spoke English at home, and we were constantly, we were just fitting in, trying to make a life. They were working and trying to make a new life here. So they worked very hard, and we didn't really have exposure as children growing up in that small town to other Indian families, and I didn't have exposure to the culture. And so my parents didn't really, I think the work of just living, assimilating was enough. Like we didn't do any, I didn't learn about my own culture. I didn't learn the traditions. I didn't know the language. So, and when other people later as an adult would see me and they would ask me or expect me to know something, I didn't know it, and I felt ashamed and I felt embarrassed. And I thought, why didn't I know it? And it's not my parents' fault. It's just the way that it was. So so I grew up with a sense of loss. Like I felt this loss for my parents' sake, but also for my sake. Like there was this whole part of my identity that I didn't even know, that I felt like I should know. So there was also some shame mixed in there. But eventually, you know what? That is replaced though with this desire to learn, to recover those things that I didn't have. I can still learn them. It's not over. It's still possible to learn and appreciate those things that they had we lost, right? And I think it's probably a greater sense of loss for my parents really than for me, because they're the ones who didn't really get to participate in some of the ways and traditions and cultural things that they did when they were living in India. So I feel like it's a greater loss for them. I wrote the survey and I sent it out. I wanted to get firsthand stories and perspectives from those who were also experiencing. So it wasn't just my own stories. I really wanted to pull in other people's experiences from other backgrounds, other racial and ethnic groups. So that was also just part of my learning, but also part of the sharing and understanding. Because even though there are things that are common to us as ethnic minorities, there are also unique things about each of us. So my experience as a South Asian woman is different, say, from a Black woman or a Black man or a Latino woman, right? There are different unique dynamics of us belonging and fitting in, and our communities are different, our backgrounds are different. So I wanted to pull in all those different perspectives and understand, well, what is it like for you? What are the unique parts for you? Being a foreigner, being an immigrant, being a refugee, being someone who's consistently a minority. And so I wanted to share that because I can't automatically know that without hearing their story, because yeah, I don't know what it's like to be in their shoes, but I want to learn, and I want to ask and to seek to understand, what that feels like. So it was eye-opening, and it was really wonderful to have that kind of feedback that I could share with readers in the book. One thing that I would love to see happening is that we normalize conversations like this, that we normalize talking about loneliness. We normalize talking about ethnic loneliness, that sense of being othered, the sense of being marginalized, the sense of disbelonging in your spaces. So, talking about loneliness and normalizing these conversations about belonging, that's something I would love to see happen. And let's destigmatize it and let's normalize it.